Who can Germany trust these days? Chancellor Angela Merkel says neither the US nor the UK can be relied on, so the European Union should plan its own destiny. What does that mean for the Transatlantic Alliance? And can the EU go it alone? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Angela Merkel is Germany's Chancellor, but is also seen by some as Europe's leader. So when she says the European Union can't rely on the US and UK, that creates waves. Merkel's concerned that the long-standing allies are drifting in a new direction, with Donald Trump in the US and post-Brexit Britain. Merkel's warning comes a few days after European leaders didn't see eye to eye with Trump at the G7 and NATO summits. They failed to agree on various issues, including climate change and the two-year-old refugee crisis. Merkel says Europe can't always trust the US and UK going forward.
The times when we could completely count on others, they are over to a certain extent. I've experienced this in the last few days, and that's why I can only say that we Europeans must really take our fate into our own hands. Of course, in friendship with the United States of America, in friendship with Great Britain, and as good neighbors, wherever that is possible, also with other countries, even with Russia. But we have to know that we must fight for a future on our own, for our destiny as Europeans, and that's what I want to do together with you.
The US and UK stand apart from most of Europe on a number of issues. For example, 6 of the 7 leaders at the G7 summit renewed their commitment to the Paris Agreement on climate change. Trump said he needed more time to decide. At the NATO summit, Trump repeated previous accusations that other members of the alliance were failing to pay their share of the defense budget. UK and US leaders have spoken in favor of more protectionist trade practices, whereas the EU has been built around a foundation of open trade policies. And going to the heart of the issue, Trump has repeatedly questioned the value of the EU. He welcomed Britain's vote to leave and spoke positively of anti-EU politicians such as the French far-right leader Marine Le Pen. Let's now get to our guests. In Berlin, Thorsten Benner, he's an adjunct faculty member at Hertie School of Governance. He's also the director of Global Public Policy Institute. In Paris, Charles Lichfield, he is the Europe Associate for Eurasia Group and a specialist on EU-US relations. And in Lewis, Delaware, Lawrence Kolb, he is a former US Assistant Secretary of Defense. He joins us via Skype. Welcome to the program. Let me start by asking Mr. Thorsten Benner this. Mr. Thorsten, do you think this statement from Merkel that she cannot rely anymore on the US a sign that the Transatlantic Alliance won't be the same again?
No, I think the discussion on this has been way overblown. We need to realize that Merkel used almost exactly the same words in January after Trump's inaugural speech. And these comments are strictly for domestic consumption primarily, and is working out beautifully for Merkel. The headline in today's largest circulation daily in Germany runs like the whole world is talking about the hardline approach the Chancellor takes to Trump. We have elections coming up in Germany, and Mrs. Merkel doesn't want to be out anti-Trump by her challenger, Mr. Schulz. That's why she's taking this approach, and she's also taking it because, of course, Europe should take its own fate more into its own hands, but that doesn't mean the end of the transatlantic alliance.
Let me bring in Mr. Charles Lichfield. Mr. Lichfield, Benner was talking about the fact that this statement has been more motivated by campaign considerations, but aren't we, in fact, dealing with huge differences between the EU on one hand and the United States of America about different issues, particularly the role of NATO and defense considerations?
Yes, I mean, Mr. Benner is right that we must remember the domestic dimension of Merkel's speech, and she was speaking in Bavaria to her sister party, which she hasn't had the best of relationships with recently, but there is a common denominator, and that is the fact that Germans have been quite scared by what has happened outside of Germany, and therefore she can come across as a safe pair of hands. But it's also important to remember that Mrs. Merkel has just had a very difficult, trying week where she's had to deal with Donald Trump, the US president, on two separate occasions at the NATO summit in Brussels and also at the G7 summit in Sicily. And on both occasions, I think Mr. Trump essentially did things which confirmed to Mrs. Merkel and other leaders that she gets on well with that he isn't someone that they're going to be able to have an easy relationship with, that it will always be hard work and that they'll have to try to essentially make things come across as though they're his ideas so that he agrees to them. The Paris Climate Change Agreement is a very good example. I don't think it's likely that Mr. Trump just agrees to go along with it unless he can get something out of it that he can show to his own electorate. And that is just simply quite time-consuming for Mrs. Merkel.
Mr. Lawrence Kolb, the United States of America has been one of the pillars shaping the Transatlantic alliance. Should the Americans be concerned about what Chancellor Angela Merkel had to say?
Yeah, there's no doubt about the fact that I understand that obviously you have a political season in Germany, but I think it's also a warning to the Trump administration and Americans that we can't continue to doing what we're doing. You take a look, for example, what President Trump said about Article 5. He didn't reaffirm it. Now, this is very important because he has questioned it during the campaign, and since he's been in office, he hasn't endorsed it. So he really should have stepped up and said, no, Article 5 is still there. An attack on one is an attack on all. And he could have thanked NATO for them invoking Article 5 after 9/11 when they went to Afghanistan with us, and they're still there. The other thing I think that he shouldn't have done what he did when he was with in Saudi Arabia, where he said, I'm not here to lecture. Well, he came to lecture and he started complaining about the 2% of GDP, even though that doesn't have to be accomplished till 2024.
Okay.
And then, of course, on trade, he made no sense because we don't just trade with Germany. The policies are decided by the EU. And the whole question about the imbalance, the Germans make an awful lot of cars here in the United States.
We will go into details about those different issues. Let me go back to Mr. Charles Lichfield. Mr. Lichfield, let's start with the NATO as one of the issues of disagreement between the United States of America and the EU. Are the EU key players, Germany, Italy, France, for example, concerned the United States of America is not going to be further involved aggressively in Europe anymore in the future?
Well, there's some concern, but it's also seen by the countries you mentioned as an opportunity to bolster EU defence cooperation. Those are the countries that I think are the most enthusiastic about it. Britain was for a long time much more reluctant, and now that it is leaving the EU, this is seen as an opportunity in Western Europe to actually go further with EU defence, although they haven't been very precise for the moment. I think the countries that will be the most concerned by Trump's failure to reaffirm Article 5 will be those that are located slightly further east, that are also part of NATO. I'm thinking of Poland and also the Baltic states, who really see their membership of NATO as existential, given the fact that they have recent memories of Russian foreign policy that was, shall we say, quite aggressively involved in their own existence, and they think that it is possible that Russia may redevelop those ambitions. Now, people can disagree or agree with them, but they certainly feel that being part of NATO and having a strong NATO alliance where the US is committed to it is important simply for their existence. And I think they'll be the most frightened by what Mr. Trump said or failed to say last week.
Let me go back to Mr. Kolb in Delaware. Mr. Kolb, President Trump is known for his ambivalent attitude towards Article 5, which is the mutual defense doctrine of NATO, and against the backdrop of what he said in the past about NATO as obsolete. Do you think that he's now more determined than ever to sort of reinvent NATO itself or abandon it completely in the future?
Well, I think basically he is trying to get Europeans to do more because Americans basically feel that we have a lot of countries around the world that are free riders in terms of depending on us for their national security. I mean, if you take a look, we're spending about $700 billion a year on defense right now. We're about a quarter of what all the NATO spends. And I think Americans, given our debt problems and given some of the concerns about what we're paying for, healthcare, really feel they'd like to shirk some of that burden. That's one of the reasons why Trump got elected. So I think that's the point he's trying to make. It didn't play well in Europe, but it probably played pretty well here in the United States, the things that he said.
Let me go now to Mr. Benner in Berlin. Mr. Benner, EU leaders during the NATO summit were waiting to hear some reassuring words from President Donald Trump. What they got instead was bashing from the president, bashing the NATO partners for not spending more on defense, and also asking them to match the US defense budget, which stands at 2% of the GDP. Do you think this was interpreted by the EU, particularly by Germany, as a sign that the Americans are trying to distance themselves from the NATO?
Not necessarily. I mean, we were expecting these were the words of Mr. Trump before, and he dropped, for example, the talk about NATO being obsolete. In fact, in his speech, that was a little hard charging at times, he committed himself to NATO. And I don't share the assessment of some who are saying that just because he didn't reaffirm Article 5, that this will invite Mr. Putin to attack Europe on the NATO eastern flank, because everything's unpredictable that Mr. Trump does. And also the response of Mr. Trump, whether he will then uphold alliance solidarity or not, will be unpredictable also for Mr. Putin. So had Mr. Trump affirmed Article 5 in that particular speech, he may give an interview next week where he says the opposite. So we just have to live with the fact that life with President Trump is inherently unpredictable, and we need to engage in damage control on the part of Europe and need to learn to live with that.
Okay, I mean, the need to live with that. But at the same time, we're talking about some issues that really could reshape the whole region. Let me go to Mr. Korb. Mr. Korb, you served as Assistant Secretary of Defense, and you know how the region is obsessed with the need to have NATO serving as an ultimate defense against threats, particularly from Russia. But Trump, during the visit to NATO, he did not focus on the threat that Russia poses to Europe, which left many people concerned there.
Well, I think they should, because in the campaign, he praised Putin several times. We now have found out since he's been president that he reveals stuff to the Russian foreign minister and the Russian ambassador about sensitive intelligence that apparently came from Israel. We have seen his son-in-law now being under investigation for trying to set up a secret channel with the Russians after the elections. So there is a lot of concern about how he really, does feel about Russia and the steps that they're taking, whether it's in Crimea, Ukraine, what they're doing with exercises around the Baltics, putting more forces into Kaliningrad. So I think it is important for him to take advantage of the NATO meeting to reassure people. And as one of my colleagues said here, particularly the people in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, that we're with them, and an attack on one is an attack on all.
Mr. Lichfield, let's imagine you were the president of...
That's true, but can I come in?
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead.
I think we should evaluate Mr. Trump by his deeds on Russia. And his administration has reaffirmed the sanctions regime. His administration has not cut a deal with Russia over Europeans' heads. And they have also reaffirmed the reinforced troop commitment to NATO's eastern flank. So far, the balance sheet on Russia policy with regard to Trump is much less worse than we could have expected just a few months ago. And so that's the kind of realistic assessment I think that we need.
Mr. Lichfield, in Paris, let's imagine for a second you were president of France and you look at the map, at the geostrategic map of this whole transatlantic alliance. You have the US more driven by nationalistic policies, UK leaving the EU, you're left on your own as the EU. Isn't this a moment that would just push you to think more about redrawing the map and thinking about EU taking its fate in its own hand, exactly as Merkel said?
Well, I couldn't possibly put myself in the position of the newly elected President Macron, but I suppose it's a good point in the discussion to talk about France because of the fact that, yes, the Trump administration hasn't been as friendly to Russia as we might have expected when he came to power, although I do agree with the former Undersecretary of Defense that there are some rather concerning elements emerging from Washington at the moment. But France is in a very interesting position, and in fact, at this very point where we're talking, Mr. Macron is meeting Mr. Putin in Versailles. And this does seem rather surprising, given that Macron was perhaps the most anti-Putin candidate of the French presidential candidates, at least amongst the main ones. And now this is, I think, the second foreign leader that he's invited to Paris, and they're even going to see an exhibition together. So symbolically, I suppose they're trying to show that there is a more long-standing friendship involved, despite the problems that the EU has had with Russia over the past few years. So Mr. Macron's priority is obviously Germany and working on the EU relationship. How does Russia fit into all of this? It's certainly the case that Russia has isolated itself and doesn't really appear to be a trustworthy player to either Berlin or Paris. But I also think Russia has been surprised by how unpredictable President Trump is. And I see in Putin's visit to Paris an attempt to flatter Mr. Macron, to tell him that to show him that he is a president that Mr. Putin considers a worthy statesman, who's someone who'll be around for a very long time.
I see your point.
And not necessarily an attempt to drive a wedge between Putin and between Merkel and Macron, but simply I think the Russians also understand that the Trump administration is just too unpredictable. It's not Russia-friendly or EU-friendly, it's just unpredictable.
I see your
point. The Russians are trying also, I think, to think in the long term about how they can find their own friends.
Mr. Kurb, is it possible to maintain an alliance based on defense, trade, when you have the key players not sharing the same values?
Well, I think it's going to be hard. I agree that a lot of times Trump will say one thing and do another. But I think the last thing you want in a defense alliance is unpredictability. I mean, I think we may need to make it clear exactly what will happen if the Russians were to do certain things. And so I think that is the key thing. And the last thing you want when it comes to defense and national security is unpredictability. I think you need to make it clear what exactly we will do under what circumstances and what we will not do. And so that's what I really worry about, is the unpredictability. I agree that sometimes, Trump says one thing and then does another. But the fact of the matter is that is not a good way to make policy. You should say one thing and do it.
Mr. Benner, you've been saying from the beginning of this show that basically this is not to be considered as a shift in the transatlantic alliance, but was the domestic agenda present when Merkel made this? I mean, we know that she is leading the polls recently. Is she trying to appeal to her own constituency in Germany?
Yes, of course she's talking to her own constituency, which is very critical, of course, of Mr. Trump. In fact, the recent coming together of the European centrist forces from Macron to Merkel can be ascribed to opposition to Mr. Trump, because a lot of European voters see Mr. Trump in action, the unpredictability that Mr. Korb talked about, and they don't like it. Mrs. Merkel wants to be reelected in the fall. She has a challenger who is very pro-European, who is very anti-Trump, Mr. Schulz, and who is also skeptical of this 2% goal of military spending. And Mrs. Merkel tried to reframe the debate, positioning herself as skeptical of Mr. Trump. She has also been positioning herself as much more pro-European and in love with the idea that of the European project recently. And at the same time, she says we need to take our fate in our own hands. Meaning, if we spend more on the military, it won't be to please Mr. Trump,
I see your point.
but in order to be able to direct our fate a little bit more. So she has done this quite a masterful move in the German domestic
ahead of the
debate that
elections,
she's performed over the past
which
week.
will be held in September.
Yeah.
Mr. Lichfield, can we frame this whole debate as a ramification of the polarization which is underway between the advocates of globalization, Merkel as an example, and the defenders of nationalistic agenda, Trump and the populists now in Europe in particular?
To an extent, I suppose you could, but I think Trump is really isolated in the position of being of the nationalist ilk, and even in his policy, we haven't quite seen him completely shift U.S. policy in that direction. It was much more his manner of campaigning that suggested that he might take U.S. policy in that direction, and since then, I really haven't seen too much of a big shift, at least in U.S. foreign policy, although Mr. Korb is quite right to suggest that the unpredictability creates uncertainty, and we do have to get used to this more uncertain world. Mrs. Merkel is in a very good position to win the election in September. And I agree with Mr. Benner that she's, as many times before, discreetly worked out how she can make quite a masterful move, bringing both her own constituency in line and people who might just be seeking for a safe pair of hands, for someone who seeks to defend Germany's interests, but also connect those with some slightly more idealistic ideas. It appears to me that she's managed to put all of these together in quite a clever way. Okay. I would perhaps criticize, however, her sense of timing in that the speech she made in a beer hall, which was for domestic consumption, has gone viral, and it is something that people are rather worried about. I suppose that she must realize that whatever she says, especially when it comes to how Germany will relate to the US and the UK in future, will be heard in those countries and may be slightly misinterpreted. I think it is true that it has been overblown, but still, words bear meaning, and I think it will take time for, especially in the UK, for them to realize that she isn't entirely pushing the UK away, but simply trying to reframe the debate in the European context or the EU context for her domestic audience.
It could be taken out of proportion, but however, it does not undermine the fact that we're talking about series, a set of differences between the Europeans and the Americans. Mr. Cope, we're talking about whatever the motives of the Americans or the Europeans, we're talking about differences, and you can tell that there is no vision within the United States of America about how to move forward when it comes to foreign policy, particularly with regards to EU and NATO. Aren't you concerned that this is something that could undermine US leadership globally?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that it could undermine US leadership. If you take a look in the United States, there's a big gap between what we call the foreign policy establishment and people in the middle of the country, as opposed to California and New York. And a lot of people in those areas are blaming things like globalization, the idea of dropping trade barriers for the economic problems that they're facing. And Trump, unfortunately, got elected by appealing to those people. And basically, what he did over in Europe, what we call the foreign policy establishment, was obviously very concerned about. But the majority of people, as I mentioned before, they're fine with it. They think that, the Germans are taking us to the cleaners with, making all the cars that we buy, and in fact, they even want to break the trade deals with Canada and Mexico. So no, I don't think so. And as I mentioned before, there's a feeling that we spend too much on defense.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Thorsten Benner, Charles Lichfield, and Lawrence Korb, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here, bye for now.